Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Faces of History, the podcast where we peel back the layers of the legendary, the overlooked, and the forgotten souls who shaped our world in ways your school books probably skipped. I'm your host, the Duke of New York, and tonight we're telling the story of a woman whose name should be as well known as any founding father, but too often is left out of the pages of American memory. Her name was Elizabeth Freeman, but in her time they called her Mum Bett. She was born enslaved. She was expected to die enslaved, but she didn't. Instead, she heard the words, "All men are born free and equal," and did something radical. She sued for her freedom and won. Tonight, we're going to dive deep. Who was Elizabeth Freeman? What was her world like? How did she summon the courage to stand up in a court of law while America itself was fighting for its own freedom? And what legacy did she leave behind for generations to come? So pour yourself something good, get comfortable, and let's meet the woman who made America's promise of freedom mean something real. Let's roll the clock all the way back to the mid-1700s, to the cold hills and fertile valleys of New England, where freedom was already on everyone's lips, but not for everyone's life. Elizabeth Freeman, known then only as Bett, came into this world around 1744, though no one wrote down her birthday. That right to have your birth recorded, to belong to a family line with dates carved in a family Bible, was not for people like Bett. She was born on the margins, owned from her first breath by another family's wealth. Her mother was enslaved. Her father likely was too, or maybe unknown, because in the world Bett was born into, the record keepers didn't see a child, they saw property. In all likelihood, Bett was born on a farm in Claverack, New York, owned by the Hoogboom family. Prosperous Dutch settlers who, like many in the Hudson River Valley, built their estates and comforts on the backs of black labor. Picture her early life, a small enslaved girl with bare feet in winter, calloused hands in summer, gathering firewood, hauling water, weeding gardens, feeding chickens. She learned early that her life wasn't hers to shape. Every sunrise was someone else's command. Every mistake could mean a beating. And yet, like so many enslaved people whose stories were never fully written down, Bett's early years were filled with moments we can only imagine: whispered lullabies from her mother, stolen laughter with other enslaved children, small stolen dreams under the stars that no master could claim. Now, when Bett was still a young girl, not yet a teenager, her world changed again. Peter Hoogboom's daughter, Hannah Hoogboom, married John Ashley, a rising landowner, judge, and patriot up in Sheffield, Massachusetts. As part of this marriage, Bett and her sister were given as part of the dowry, human chattel transferred like livestock or furniture. So Bett, probably just 6 or 7, was forced to leave behind whatever scraps of home she knew and make the cold journey north into the Berkshire Hills, traded away like a wedding gift. She entered the Ashley household at a time when that name meant status, land, and growing political power. John Ashley was well connected, a judge, a lawyer, a local leader who loved to host gatherings for the area's elite. But for Bett, none of that mattered. Her life inside the Ashley household was not fine talk of liberty and revolution. It was laundry, cooking, scrubbing floors, stoking fires before dawn. She was expected to work from childhood through old age, with no pay, no education, and no say over her body or her future. She saw the contradiction up close, every day. The same people who spoke of the rights of man, who wrote declarations about freedom and equality around John Ashley's dinner table, owned her outright. She served the men who talked about throwing off a king's chains while keeping her in theirs. And through it all, Bett watched. She listened. She learned. She could not read the pamphlets stacked on John Ashley's shelves, but she could hear the heated arguments in the parlor. She knew these men, her master, his friends, spoke about freedom like it was sacred for themselves. But she was smart enough, even then, to know that if freedom could be argued for them, maybe, just maybe, it could be demanded for her too. It would be decades before she spoke those words out loud. Decades of back-breaking work, decades of bearing the whip and the hot iron. But inside this small girl, forced from her mother's home into a judge's kitchen, the seed of her own revolution was already there. So when we talk about Elizabeth Freeman, we have to remember this. She didn't appear fully formed as a brave woman standing in court. She was forged in kitchens, in fields, in cold Berkshire winters. Every scar, every injustice, every overheard word built the iron in her spine that would one day make her look a judge dead in the eye and say, "I heard your Constitution, now make it true for me." And that's where we leave part one. A little girl named Bett, born enslaved, forced to serve the very people who would teach her the language of freedom they never meant for her to claim. Stay with me, because in the next part, we'll see how this quiet young servant turned her listening ears and fierce heart into a fight that would shake the chains off an entire state. So, we've met Bett, the young girl born into bondage, traded like property, forced to listen to fine words about freedom she was never meant to taste. But how did she become Elizabeth Freeman, the woman who knew she was worth more than any master's claim? The truth is, Bett grew up under a system that did everything it could to break a person's sense of self. Enslavement didn't just steal labor, it tried to steal dignity, agency, pride. But some people somehow managed to hold on to an unshakable sense of who they were inside, no matter what the world called them. Bett was one of those people. Inside the Ashley house, she became more than a servant. She became the backbone of that household, the one who made sure the fires stayed hot, the food was ready, the children were safe. Over time, the other enslaved people and hired help began to call her Mum Bett, a name that says something powerful about how they saw her. She wasn't just a laborer, she was a protector, a caretaker, a woman other people trusted. But strength like hers didn't come without cost. Hannah Ashley, John Ashley's wife, was known to be strict, harsh, even cruel. There's a story that lives on like a legend. One day, Hannah raised a red-hot fireplace shovel at another enslaved girl in the house. Some say it may have been Bett's sister. Bett stepped in. She stood between that white woman and the girl, and Hannah struck her instead, burning Bett's arm badly enough to leave a deep scar. Now, here's where you see who Bett really was. She could have hidden that burn. She could have covered it up with sleeves, tried to forget it. But she didn't. Bett kept that scar visible. Later in life, when people asked her why she didn't try to cover it, she said, "I left it as a mark for freedom." Think about that for a second. A brand meant to shame her. She turned it into a badge of courage, a reminder that she had the right to stand up for herself, even in a world that told her she had no rights at all. This is the kind of moral courage that made people listen when she spoke. Bett had no formal education. She could neither read nor write, but she understood power and dignity in a way books can't teach. She watched, she listened, she learned. The Ashley household was a crossroads for big ideas. John Ashley hosted local revolutionary leaders, men who sat at the dinner table and declared all men equal while their coats were brushed and their plates were cleared by people like Bett. They called themselves patriots. They wanted liberty from a king. Bett asked herself, if freedom is good enough for you, why not for me? Some stories say that in the evenings, Bett would stand near doorways, pretending to be invisible, catching every word about the Sheffield Declaration, that local statement of revolutionary principles that said, mankind in a state of nature are equal, free, and independent. Those words didn't stay on paper for her. They settled in her mind. Bett didn't need a parchment to tell her she was equal. She knew it in her bones. But now, for the first time, she saw a way to make the law see it too. She became known in Sheffield not just as a hard worker, but as someone who didn't shrink from speaking her mind. She defended others. She didn't tolerate abuse if she could stop it. That fireplace shovel proved it. And she wasn't afraid to speak truth to power, even in private moments. Legend says Bett once told John Ashley's friends, if 1 minute's freedom had been offered to me, and I had been told I must die at the end of that minute, I would have taken it, just to stand 1 minute on God's air a free woman. Imagine the force of that statement, coming from a woman people thought should be silent, grateful, obedient. Bett's sense of self-worth made her dangerous, not in the violent sense, but in the sense that ideas can be dangerous. Once a person knows their worth, you can't chain that mind forever. So by the late 1770s, Bett, Mum Bett, was no ordinary servant waiting for someone to rescue her. She was a woman ready to test whether this talk of liberty really included her. She knew her worth, and she was about to ask the entire Commonwealth of Massachusetts to put its money where its mouth was. Next, we'll see what happens when a woman like that walks into a lawyer's office and says, "I heard your new constitution says all men are born free and equal. Now tell me, does that mean me too?" Stay with me.
Read in part 3.
By the time the 1770s rolled around, the little town of Sheffield, Massachusetts, was alive with the smell of revolution. Gunpowder, ink, tobacco smoke, and heated words echoing through taverns and parlor rooms. Mum Bett, the woman we now know as Elizabeth Freeman, was right in the thick of it, though not by choice. Remember, she was John Ashley's property, and his house was no ordinary household. It was a meeting place for the brightest local patriots. Men with powdered wigs and restless minds. Men who saw themselves as the sharp tip of the spear aimed at King George's throat. They called themselves the Sheffield Committee of Correspondence. They wrote letters by candlelight and nailed resolutions to doorposts. They whispered about throwing off tyranny, about unalienable rights that no king could take away. They called for militias and weapons and the burning of loyalist pamphlets. And all the while, behind the door that separated the parlor from the kitchen, Mum Bett was listening, ears sharp as a hawk. She carried in tea and bread, cleared plates, stoked the fire. She heard men like Theodore Sedgwick, a young, fiery lawyer, arguing that freedom was every man's birthright. She heard Judge John Ashley thunder about the wickedness of British taxes, how no free man should submit to unjust rulers. But she also saw the hypocrisy plain as day. The same men who raised their tankards to toast liberty or death would hand her a dirty dish without a second thought. They dreamed of freedom for themselves, but the people standing right next to them in the shadows, the enslaved cooks, maids, and farmhands, were conveniently left out of that picture. Imagine being Bett, a woman with no reading or writing, but a mind as sharp as any lawyer's in that room. She knew how to listen. She had a memory like iron. And every time she heard the word freedom, it didn't roll off her back. It dug deep. If all men are born free and equal, as they claimed in their bold new declarations, then what about her? In 1773, right there in Ashley's parlor, the Sheffield Committee drafted the Sheffield Resolves, one of the first public statements of resistance against British tyranny in the colonies. That document proclaimed, "Mankind in a state of nature are equal, free, and independent of each other." Bett didn't need a Harvard degree to grasp what that meant. If mankind meant all men, and all men were born free, how could any man claim to own her? In the broader world, revolution was heating up like a forge. Lexington and Concord, Bunker Hill, news traveled fast, even to the kitchens of Berkshire County. Men were mustering muskets and donning homemade uniforms. Towns like Sheffield were alive with the sound of blacksmiths hammering gun barrels, boys drilling in fields, and church bells tolling for war. But the enslaved people in Massachusetts, and there were thousands, had a revolution to dream about too. Some fled to join the British, who promised freedom to those who would fight for the crown. Others stayed and waited, listening, planning. Bett was one of those who chose to stay, not because she didn't long for freedom, but because she understood the power of words and law. She didn't need a musket or a bayonet. She had something sharper, the new Massachusetts Constitution of 1780, hot off the presses, straight from the same men who called themselves patriots. It opened with a bombshell. All men are born free and equal and have certain natural, essential, and unalienable rights. There it was, in black and white, not whispered in taverns or mumbled over punch bowls, but written into the very law of the state. For most of the new republic's leaders, that phrase was about white men shaking off a king. But for Bett, for Mum Bett, that line was a key, waiting to unlock her chains. She didn't sit quietly hoping someone else would notice. She decided to test those words the way they were meant to be tested, in a court of law. Because if those words were true for John Ashley and the men in his parlor, they had to be true for her too. And here's what's remarkable. Bett didn't have secret pamphlets or an army behind her. She had only her conviction. She knew her worth, she knew her scar from that fireplace shovel still burned under her sleeve, and she knew the law said she was free, whether John Ashley liked it or not. So she did something that no enslaved person in Massachusetts had ever done in this way. She walked out of the Ashley house, crossed the dusty Berkshire roads to the office of that same young lawyer she'd once heard talking big about freedom. Freedom. Theodore Sedgwick. Picture that moment. A black woman in her late 30s, still legally someone's property, standing in front of a white male attorney and saying, "I heard what you wrote. Now prove it applies to me." In that moment, the fight for American freedom became something more than slogans. It became personal. Bett was about to put the new nation's ideals on trial and force the courts to decide, did all men really mean all? And that's where we'll pick up next, when Bett takes her place in the courthouse, not as property, but as a plaintiff demanding her freedom with the full weight of the revolution's words behind her. Stay with me, because in part 4, we'll see exactly how Mum ready to become Elizabeth Freeman turned a war for independence into a war for her own life. So there she was, Mum Bett, a woman who knew her worth, a woman with a scar she refused to hide. And now she was about to do something unthinkable in a world that counted her as property. She was about to drag her master, one of the most powerful men in Berkshire County, into a courtroom and force the law to answer a simple question. Did the promise of freedom apply to her too? Let's paint this moment right. It's 1781. The American Revolution is still raging. George Washington's men are freezing and bleeding for independence from a king 3,000 miles away. Massachusetts is buzzing with whispers of liberty, but liberty is a complicated word when you live in a state where slavery is still legal. Mum Bett walks into the law office of Theodore Sedgwick, a sharp young lawyer who helped draft that shiny new Massachusetts Constitution. Sedgwick had always spoken big about freedom and equality. Now he had a test case staring him right in the face. When Bett told Sedgwick her story, how she'd been burned, how she'd listened to their fine talk of liberty, how she wanted her freedom under the very Constitution they'd written, Sedgwick must have known this was a moment that could shake the whole system. He agreed to take her case. He brought in a second lawyer, too, Tapping Reeve, a legal mind so brilliant he would later help found America's first law school. But Sedgwick also knew this wouldn't be easy. Bett was still, under the eyes of the old colonial law, someone's legal property. If they lost, she could be punished, sold away, maybe even beaten worse than before. She had everything to lose: her home, her family, her safety. She said, "I will not be owned." And she wasn't alone. Another enslaved man from the Ashley household named Brom joined her. Together they filed a lawsuit, Brom and Bett v. Ashley. Two people who had been born into bondage were now the plaintiffs in a case that would force a Massachusetts court to decide if the ideals of the revolution were real or just ink on paper. The case went before the County Court of Common Pleas in Great Barrington, a small town but a huge stage for an idea that threatened to topple an entire way of life. Imagine the scene: a small courthouse crowded with local farmers, neighbors, maybe even people who secretly owned slaves themselves, all curious to see what would happen. The argument was simple, and yet radical. Sedgwick and Reeve argued that the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780 was clear. All men are born free and equal. That meant slavery itself had no place under the new law. If the court upheld John Ashley's claim of ownership, they'd be saying that those words in the Constitution meant nothing, that the Revolution's promise of equality was just empty talk. Ashley's lawyers, meanwhile, fought hard to defend the old status quo. They argued that slavery had always been part of Massachusetts life, that the law of property overruled this new, vague idea of freedom for all. They pointed out that Bett and Brom had no money, no land, no formal education. Who were they to stand equal in a court of law with their master, a judge, no less? But Bett herself was the most powerful argument in the room. There she stood, proud, unbowed, her burn scar a silent witness to her courage. She wasn't pleading, she was demanding. Witnesses spoke of how calm she was, how steady her voice. She didn't flinch under questioning. The jury, 12 white men of their time, listened. They didn't just see Bett. They saw the words they'd sworn to live by staring them down from that new Constitution. If they found for Ashley, they'd be admitting that all men didn't mean all. That maybe the whole revolution was built on a lie. In the end, it didn't take long for the jury to come back with a verdict that would make history. Bett and Brom were free. The court ruled that slavery was incompatible with the Massachusetts Constitution. John Ashley was ordered to pay them damages, 30 shillings each, a small sum but symbolic, a master paying former slaves for wrongful enslavement. It's hard to overstate how radical this was. This was decades before the Emancipation Proclamation, decades before Harriet Tubman, decades before the Civil War. Here in a small rural court, a black woman with no formal power flipped the system upside down. And what did Bett do next? She did not run and hide. She did not flee the state. In fact, John Ashley, who had just been humiliated in court, offered to hire her back, this time as a paid servant. Bett turned him down flat. Instead, she went to work for Theodore Sedgwick, the very lawyer who had defended her, as a paid employee. In his household, she wasn't Mum Bett the slave. She was Elizabeth Freeman, a free woman with wages of her own, respect of her own, and a new name that said exactly what she was: free. Think about that. She didn't just win freedom for herself. Her case helped topple slavery in Massachusetts altogether. Courts across the state began citing her verdict. By the mid-1780s, slavery had practically vanished from Massachusetts soil. Not by war, not by decree from on high, but by a single black woman who dared to stand in a courtroom and say, "Prove you own me." That's putting freedom on trial and winning. And when we come back for part 5, we'll see how Elizabeth Freeman, once called Mum Bett, used her freedom to build a life that gave her family, her neighbors, and generations to come a glimpse of what real liberty could look like. Stay with me. Elizabeth Freeman. No longer Mum Bett the slave. No longer someone else's property. No longer an invisible figure in a wealthy man's kitchen. She was, by her own courage and the power of her own words, a free woman in a nation still figuring out what freedom really meant. Now, you might think that winning her case was the end of the story, but for Elizabeth Freeman, it was only the beginning. Because what do you do when the law finally says you belong to yourself? Where do you go when the world is still dangerous and your freedom, though legal, is surrounded by people who might resent you for daring to claim it? Bett, now Elizabeth Freeman, didn't disappear into history's shadows. She stepped forward and built a life that would remind everyone around her that freedom wasn't just an idea written on parchment. It was a living, breathing fact. After her court victory in 1781, John Ashley, yes, the same man who claimed to own her, had the audacity to offer her paid work as a servant in his household. Think about that for a second. The same master who lost his claim to her body wanted to keep her labor for wages this time. But Elizabeth didn't hesitate. She turned him down flat. She was free, and she'd decide where she'd go. Instead, she chose to go with the man who had believed in her case, Theodore Sedgwick, the young lawyer and patriot who had argued her freedom in court. She accepted a paid position in the Sedgwick household in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, not as a slave, but as a housekeeper, nurse, and trusted member of the family. She was free to negotiate her own wages. She was free to set her own terms. Now, don't think for a second that Elizabeth Freeman just cleaned floors and cooked meals in her new home. No, no, no. She was more than a servant. She was a pillar, a moral compass, a living legend right there in the Sedgwick house. She helped raise the Sedgwick children, tending to them like her own kin. Those kids and their children would later write about how Mum Bett was the heart of the household. She also used her freedom to secure something no enslaved person ever legally had: property. Over time, Elizabeth saved her wages and bought a small piece of land of her own in Stockbridge. Let that sink in. This woman, who'd once been owned by another human being, now owned land in her own name. She built a modest home for herself and her daughter Betsy, and she made sure Betsy had opportunities Elizabeth herself never had. And here's where we see the real heartbeat of who Elizabeth Freeman was. She didn't hoard her freedom for herself alone. She used it as a foundation for her family's freedom too. She educated her children. She raised her grandchildren in her own home. She used her hard-earned wages to make sure that her line would not go back into bondage. In the Sedgwick house, Elizabeth was more than an employee. She was an advisor, a healer. People in Stockbridge, black and white alike, came to her for medical help because she had learned the arts of midwifery and herbal healing. She delivered babies. She nursed the sick. She was a keeper of knowledge, knowledge that in those days only women like her kept alive. When her children and grandchildren faced trouble, and the world was still full of it for free Black families, they knew they had Elizabeth Freeman to stand by them. And for the Sedgwicks, who would go on to become a famous Massachusetts family, she was a constant reminder of what their lofty talk of liberty really looked like when lived out with courage and resolve. Stories from the Sedgwick descendants tell us she was respected, loved, and never treated as anything less than the matriarch she was. One Sedgwick child, Catherine Maria Sedgwick, would grow up to become a famous writer. She credited Elizabeth Freeman's life story as one of her greatest inspirations. In her words, Elizabeth was one of the noblest women God ever made. But even as she lived free, Elizabeth never forgot what her life had cost her, or what her courage had bought for others. Her court victory didn't just set her free. It cracked slavery in Massachusetts wide open. After the Brom and Bett case, and a similar case called Quock Walker versus Jennison, Massachusetts effectively ended slavery by legal precedent. Elizabeth Freeman lived long enough to see that no one could ever again be bought or sold in her state. For years, she remained in Stockbridge, working, healing, raising children, telling her story to anyone who would listen. She turned a world that once treated her like a footnote into a stage where she was the main character. She didn't need fancy speeches. Her whole life was a speech. When she grew older, her home remained a refuge. She welcomed the children of her children, living proof that her line would stay free. She made sure the people around her knew her story, that she had heard the words, "All men are born free and equal," and had made those words mean something. In the final part of our story, we'll talk about how Elizabeth Freeman's life ended, and why her legacy is carved into stone and memory in a country that still struggles with what freedom really means. Stay with me, because Elizabeth Freeman's story isn't just about what she did when she lived, it's about what she left behind when she died. Part 6, How She Died and What She Left Behind. So here we are, the final chapter of Elizabeth Freeman's life. By the time the 1800s rolled around, the little girl once called Bett had become Elizabeth Freeman in every sense, free in name, free in body, free in mind. She'd done what whole armies could not do alone. She forced America to live up, at least partly, to its promise. But like all lives, hers had to end, though not before she made sure her freedom would outlive her. In her final years, Elizabeth stayed in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, the town where she'd built her new life. She lived on the small piece of land she owned outright, land that once would have been an impossible dream for a Black woman born enslaved. In that modest home, she kept her family close. Her daughter, her grandchildren, they all passed through that door, carrying forward her bloodline and her spirit. She kept working too. Even as age bent her back and silvered her hair, neighbors would still come knocking at her door for help. A midwife when a baby was on the way, a nurse when the fever struck. She never turned people away. She had once belonged to a man. Now she belonged to her community, by choice and on her own terms. It said she kept that burn scar until her dying day, never hidden, always a reminder of the line she'd crossed from bondage to liberty. That mark, more than any piece of paper, told her story. I stood up. I made them see me. Elizabeth Freeman died on December 28, 1829, around 85 years old, a remarkable age for anyone in the 19th century, let alone a Black woman who'd once been enslaved. She left this world not as Mum Bett, the property, but as a respected elder, a landowner, a matriarch. And here's where it gets even more powerful. When she died, the Sedgwick family, the same family who had taken her in as a free woman and trusted her with their children, didn't bury her on some distant plot set aside for servants or the help. No, they buried her in the Sedgwick family plot, right alongside generations of one of Massachusetts' most prominent white families. To this day, if you walk through the Stockbridge Cemetery, you'll see it. The Sedgwick Pie, as they call it, a circle of headstones for the Sedgwicks, and among them, a stone for Elizabeth Freeman, not Mum Bett, not property. Elizabeth Freeman, the only Black person buried in that family plot, a silent but thunderous statement of how deeply she was respected and loved. Her gravestone still stands, and if you look closely, you'll see the words carved there. Her own words, passed down through the Sedgwick family. She was born a slave and remained a slave for nearly 30 years. She could neither read nor write, yet in her own sphere she had no superior or equal. She neither wasted time nor property. She never violated a trust nor failed to perform a duty. In every situation of domestic trial, she was the most efficient helper and the tenderest friend. Good mother. Farewell. What a testament. What an epitaph. No titles, no grand speeches, just the truth. She knew who she was, and she made the world reckon with it. But Elizabeth Freeman's legacy is bigger than a headstone. After her court case, Massachusetts courts cited her example again and again, each time inching the state closer to total abolition. In effect, her bravery ended slavery in Massachusetts decades before the Civil War. She set a precedent that said, when the law promises freedom, it must deliver it for everyone. Her descendants would go on to live free lives because she had dared to stand up. Her courage inspired Catherine Maria Sedgwick, who became one of the first major female novelists in America. Her story spread quietly through abolitionist circles, reminding later freedom fighters, people like Sojourner Truth and Frederick Douglass, that the courts could be forced to listen if someone was brave enough to speak. For far too long, Elizabeth Freeman's name was left out of the big history books, but she's always been there, in the legacy of every lawsuit, every speech, every law that brought America closer to the promise it claimed at its founding, that all people are born free and equal. So tonight, as we close this chapter, remember this. Elizabeth Freeman didn't need a musket. She didn't need an army. She had her mind, her voice, her courage, and a single line in the Massachusetts Constitution: all men are born free and equal. She took that line, that promise, and made it mean something real. That's the story of Elizabeth Freeman, the woman they called Mum Bett, who changed America before America was ready to be changed. May we never forget that the road to freedom isn't built by generals alone, but by the quiet, relentless courage of people who decide that no one will ever own them again. Thank you for listening to Faces of History. I'm your host, the Duke of New York, and if you enjoyed this journey tonight, share it, talk about it, and remember, the people they leave out of your school books are often the ones who changed the world the most. Until next time, stay curious, stay brave, and keep looking for the untold stories that make us who we are.